So this all started a couple of weeks ago when I got an unusually thick envelope from my HOA. Normally, the only things they send out are newsletters, which are basically just passive-aggressive reminders to mow your lawn, and the occasional invoice for dues. But this time, it wasn't a newsletter. It was a list of new rules, stapled together like it was some kind of formal decree from a king. The first thing I noticed? It was weirdly specific. There was a section about how vehicles couldn't be parked in your own driveway overnight, only inside your garage. A line about how lawns needed to be at least 90% uniform grass coverage, with no visible weeds or non-native plants. And then there was this gem: quarterly interior inspections to ensure properties comply with community standards. I literally had to reread that last one, thinking I misunderstood. Interior inspections? Of my own house? I wish I could say this was just me being overly dramatic, but I immediately texted my neighbor, Aaron, to see if he'd seen it too. He didn't just see it. He was pissed. "They're not stepping a foot into my house," he texted. "What are they even smoking over there?" Now, I've lived in this neighborhood for about 5 years. It's a quiet, middle-class suburb, mostly families and retirees. It's nice. Not overly fancy, but clean and comfortable. And yeah, the HOA can be annoying, but it's mostly just parking rules and landscaping fines. No big deal. This was different. It wasn't just over the top. It felt off. The next day, I decided to send a polite email to the HOA board. I figured they'd explain things, maybe even walk it back if enough people complained. But the reply I got was anything but reassuring. "Thank you for your inquiry," wrote Bella, the HOA president. "These rules are an update to our community standards and were voted on by the board to ensure consistency and maintain property values. Compliance is mandatory." Mandatory. Now here's where things start getting weird. I asked when the vote happened because as a homeowner, I never got any notice. Bella just brushed it off, saying something vague about the board having the authority to make executive decisions, which no, they don't. HOAs have rules, like actual legal rules, they're supposed to follow. They can't just drop insane regulations out of nowhere and call it a day. Still, I wasn't ready to go full lawyer mode just yet. I figured maybe it was a misunderstanding, and I wanted to talk to some other neighbors to see if they'd heard anything. Turns out, no one had. Juliana, the retired nurse who lives across the street, told me she hadn't even opened the envelope yet. Aaron said he tried to email Bella too, and got basically the same dismissive response. And Sophie, a single mom 2 doors down, told me the rules made her super uncomfortable, but that she didn't want to make waves, because she's already gotten fines in the past for her kids' bikes being visible from the street. At this point, I started to wonder, what the hell is going on? Later that week, I noticed something new: little green flags popping up on people's lawns. They weren't on every house, just a few here and there. I didn't think much of it until I overheard Eduardo, one of the HOA board members, talking to Jeffrey, another neighbor. Eduardo said the flags were for non-compliant lawns. What? When I checked my own lawn, there was no flag, but Aaron's had one. I texted him, and he said no one from the HOA had even contacted him about it. They just flagged it. That night, I decided to go through the HOA's official bylaws. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read, and what I found made me realize something important. The HOA's new rules didn't apply to me. Here's the deal. When I bought my house, it was one of the last ones built in the neighborhood, and the original owner had negotiated some kind of grandfathered exemption from HOA changes. It's buried deep in the paperwork, but it's there in black and white. Basically, unless I voluntarily opt in to new rules, they can't enforce anything beyond the original covenants from when the HOA was first formed. In other words, I'm untouchable. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who goes out looking for fights, but I also don't back down from bullies, and something about this whole situation felt personal. The way Bella brushed me off, the green flags popping up on people's lawns, the new rules that no one voted for. It felt less like maintaining property values and more like a power trip. So, I decided to run a little test. The next day, I parked my truck right in my driveway. It's a big, beat-up old thing, not exactly HOA approved, even on a good day. And just for good measure, I went to the nursery and bought a couple of native plants, some wildflowers, a shrub, and a little cactus, and planted them in my front yard. They looked great, honestly, but more importantly, they were definitely against the new rules. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the HOA to notice. 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail, a formal violation notice from Bella herself. Your property has been flagged for non-compliance, it read. Failure to address these issues will result in a fine of $150 per day, retroactive to the date of this notice. Retroactive fines. For planting flowers. At this point, I couldn't help but laugh. I sat down at my computer and drafted an email. Bella, I received your notice regarding my property, and I'd like to remind you of a clause in my purchase agreement that exempts my property from any HOA rules. As such, the violations you've cited are not enforceable, and I will not be paying any fines. If you'd like to discuss this further, I'm happy to involve my attorney. Otherwise, I trust this matter is closed. Regards, Spencer. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, feeling oddly satisfied. But here's the thing, I wasn't done. Something about Bella and the new rules still didn't sit right with me, and I was determined to figure out what was really going on. The next morning, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A couple of strangers walking around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, peering into people's yards. I watched them stop at Aaron's place, scribble something down, and move on to Sophie's house. They didn't knock, they didn't announce themselves. And then I realized they were inspecting properties. For the first time since this started, I felt genuinely uneasy. Who were these people? Update. One Thursday morning, I dragged my trash bins to the curb like I always do. Nothing unusual. But by the end of the day, while everyone else's bins were empty and tucked neatly back in place, mine were still full. I called the waste management company, figuring it was just a mistake. After being on hold for 20 minutes, I finally got through to a rep who casually informed me, "Oh, your account was canceled by request of your HOA." What? I asked them to clarify, and the rep explained that the HOA had removed me from the community's bulk trash service list. They couldn't say why, just that it came from the HOA office. Let me tell you, I was somewhere between laughing and throwing my phone across the room. This was deliberate. I called Bella that same day. She didn't answer, of course, but when I emailed her, she responded with the kind of fake politeness that makes your blood boil. Dear Spencer, thank you for bringing this to my attention. The HOA reserves the right to modify service agreements for non-compliant properties. Please ensure your property adheres to community standards moving forward to avoid service interruptions. Regards, Bella. Translation: play by our rules or suffer the consequences. After the trash fiasco, things started to escalate. First, I got a noise complaint. Apparently, I was blasting music at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Here's the funny part. I wasn't even home. I was at work. The next day, I got another complaint. My wildflowers were spreading invasive species. Then another. My truck in the driveway was obstructing community views. And then another, this time accusing me of having hazardous debris in my yard. That debris, by the way, was a single bag of mulch I hadn't gotten around to using yet. I could tell what they were doing. They weren't just trying to enforce their nonsense rules. They were trying to bury me under so many complaints and fines that I'd either give up or leave. At this point, I decided I needed to keep a record of everything. Every letter, every email, every interaction. It all went into a folder. I even started snapping photos of my yard and driveway every morning and evening, just in case they tried to accuse me of something that wasn't true. Aaron, my neighbor, was on the receiving end of similar treatment. He told me he got a fine for having his recycling bin out too early, even though he'd put Sophie, the single mom a few houses down, had it even worse. She called me one afternoon in tears because someone from the HOA left a note saying her kid's basketball hoop was detrimental to property values. She tried to push back, but Bella just waved her off, saying it was for the good of the community. This wasn't just about me anymore. Bella and her crew were targeting anyone who didn't fall in line. Remember those clipboard-wielding strangers I mentioned in part 1? I finally figured out who they were. A week after the trash incident, I was home on a Saturday morning when I spotted them walking up my street again. This time, I decided to confront them. "Hey," I said, stepping out onto my porch as they approached. "Can I help you?" The two men, both middle-aged, wearing matching polo shirts, exchanged a look before one of them said, "We're conducting routine compliance inspections for the HOA." Routine, huh? I asked. Do you usually do these without notifying homeowners? They didn't answer. Instead, one of them scribbled something on his clipboard while the other took a photo of my yard. I felt a flicker of anger, but kept my voice calm. I didn't consent to any inspection. You're trespassing. HOA regulations allow for visual inspections of properties, one of them said, clearly reciting some script. We're authorized to document any violations. And what violations would those be? I asked, crossing my arms. They didn't answer. Instead, they turned and walked away. I watched them go, my mind racing. Who were these people? And what gave them the right to act like this? They weren't HOA board members. They weren't even homeowners. That night, I checked the HOA bylaws again, just to be sure. Nowhere did it say anything about routine compliance inspections or the HOA hiring outside contractors to police the neighborhood. This was completely made up. I started digging deeper, and what I found was interesting. Turns out Bella wasn't just the HOA president. She also ran a small consulting business on the side, a business that just so happened to include community management services. And those inspectors, they worked for her. This wasn't about maintaining property values or enforcing rules. This was a racket. Bella was using her position to funnel HOA money into her own business, all while harassing homeowners who didn't fall in line. I shared my findings with Aaron and a couple of other neighbors, and they were just as furious as I was. Aaron even dug up some old meeting minutes and found something else. Bella's landscaping company, the one her brother owned, was charging the HOA nearly double the market rate for services. We were starting to piece together the bigger picture, but we needed more proof. At this point, I decided to stop playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. First, I filed a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory agency. Yes, those exist. I included everything: the bogus fines, the fake inspections, the financial conflicts of interest. Then I reached out to a lawyer friend who specializes in HOA disputes. But the real fun came when I started sharing what I'd found with the rest of the neighborhood. Aaron and I went door to door with copies of Bella's business filings and the inflated landscaping invoices. Most people were shocked, some were angry, and a few, especially the ones who'd been on the receiving end of Bella's pettiness, were ready to march straight to the next board meeting with pitchforks. The HOA meeting was still a few days away, but Bella must have sensed the tide was turning, because she sent me an email late one night. Spencer, it has come to my attention that you have been spreading false and defamatory information about the HOA and its board members. Please be advised that further actions of this nature may result in legal consequences. Regards, Bella Defamation. Cute. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded her email to my lawyer, who assured me I was well within my rights to share factual information with other homeowners. But here's the kicker. The very next day, I got a knock on my door. It was one of Bella's inspectors, holding a brand new violation notice. Only this time, it wasn't about my truck or my wildflowers. This time they claimed I had an unapproved structure on my property. What structure? I asked. They pointed to my mailbox. My freaking mailbox. Final update. Let's start with the unapproved structure complaint about my mailbox. At first, I thought it was a joke. My mailbox is the same as it's always been. Standard height, black metal, sits on a wooden post. Nothing flashy. So I emailed Bella, again, and asked her to clarify what exactly made it unapproved. Her reply was vague at best. The mailbox does not conform to updated HOA guidelines. Please refer to Section 7.4 of the new Community Standards for specifications. Guess what? Section 7.4 doesn't even exist. At this point, I wasn't even angry anymore. It was just laughable. They were grasping at straws, and the straws were getting thinner by the day. Still, I didn't let it slide. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, who was more than happy to add it to the growing pile of evidence for our case against the HOA. Meanwhile, Aaron and I continued sharing everything we'd uncovered with the neighborhood. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, almost every homeowner was aware of Bella's shady dealings. And trust me, people were mad. The HOA meetings are usually quiet affairs. Maybe 10 or 15 people show up to hear Bella drone on about landscaping budgets and holiday decorations. This time, the room was packed. Juliana was there, arms crossed and clearly ready to throw down. Sophie was sitting near the back, looking nervous but determined. Even Jeffrey, who'd always seemed like one of Bella's allies, was there with a sour look on his face. Bella opened the meeting with her usual forced smile, acting like everything was fine. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to keep this meeting respectful and productive," she said, in that condescending tone of hers. The first few agenda items were standard HOA nonsense, approving the budget, discussing plans for the community pool, but then it was time for the open forum section. That's when things got interesting. Aaron was the first to speak. He stood up and in his calm, no-nonsense way asked, "Bella, can you explain why the HOA has been paying $10,000 a month to your brother's landscaping company, even though the contract we signed last year was for $6,000? Bella stammered for a moment before saying something about unexpected expenses and additional services. But Aaron wasn't done. He held up copies of the invoices, actual physical receipts he'd gotten from a public records request, and pointed out that the extra charges were for things like weekly consultations and administrative fees, none of which were approved by the board. "That's not all," he said, turning to the crowd. "Bella's also been using HOA funds to hire her own consulting company to inspect properties. Those clipboard guys, they don't work for us. They work for her." At this point, the room erupted. People started shouting over each other, demanding answers, calling for Bella to step down. Juliana stood up and added fuel to the fire. "And what about all the new rules? You never put them to a vote. You just made them up and tried to force them on us." Bella tried to regain control, banging her gavel like she was some kind of courtroom judge. "This is inappropriate. We're here to discuss community business, not personal attacks." But the homeowners weren't buying it. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I walked up to the front of the room with a folder full of documents and said, "Bella, you sent me a violation notice for my mailbox. Can you explain why Section 7.4, the rule you cited, doesn't exist in the HOA bylaws?" Bella's face turned bright red. She muttered something about administrative updates and clerical errors. "And while we're at it," I continued, "I'd like to know why you think it's okay to cancel my trash service and file baseless complaints against me for things like wildflowers and driveway parking. Is this how you maintain property values? Or is it just how you handle homeowners who won't fall in line?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was already on my side. By the time I finished, Bella looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. But it got worse for her. Aaron had saved the best for last. A copy of a cease and desist letter he'd sent her earlier that week, threatening legal action if she didn't provide a full financial accounting of HOA funds. Bella tried to deflect, claiming she was being unfairly targeted. But Jeffrey, the guy I thought was her ally, stood up and said, "Bella, enough. You've been lying to us for years. If you don't resign right now, I'll second Aaron's motion for a formal vote of no confidence." It all happened so fast after that. Bella resigned on the spot, but not before accusing the rest of us of undermining her leadership. Her little circle of allies tried to back her up, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to suspend all the new rules pending a full community vote. They also agreed to hire an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances. As for Bella, she packed up her things and left without another word. Over the next few weeks, things slowly started to return to normal. The green flags disappeared from people's lawns. The trash service was restored. And the wildflowers in my yard? They're still there, blooming like crazy. The audit revealed even more shady financial dealings, enough to justify filing a lawsuit against Bella and her brother. I don't know how that'll play out, but honestly, I'm just glad she's gone. As for me, I've learned a lot from this whole ordeal. First, never underestimate how far a petty HOA president will go to protect their power. And second, always read the fine print when you buy a house. You never know when a little clause about grandfathered exemptions might save your sanity.